What if I told you that George Russell's victory in Australia might not be as clean as it seems? What if behind Mercedes' dominance in Melbourne was hidden a technical advantage that is making the rest of the teams in the paddock explode? Because that is exactly what is happening right now in Formula One. After the Australian Grand Prix, several teams filed formal complaints with the FIA after analyzing the Mercedes track data. The telemetry showed something strange, something that did not fit with the normal behavior of current hybrid engines. Russell's car seemed to have constant electric power on the straights, without suffering the typical energy deployment limit that affects all other teams. In a matter of hours, the controversy exploded within the paddock. Ferrari, Red Bull, and other teams began to talk about a possible regulatory loophole that Mercedes could be taking advantage of in its power unit, while engineers analyzed every data of the hybrid system and the thermal engine of the German car. The suspicions are so serious that the FIA has already opened a formal technical investigation to review the car's software, engine maps, and energy management. And most important of all, the Grand Prix results remain provisional. That is, Russell's victory still stands, but it could change if the FIA discovers that Mercedes is using a system that exceeds the limits of the technical regulations. So the big question right now is this: are we seeing a masterpiece of engineering within the law, or one of the biggest technical scandals in recent years in Formula One? Because what the FIA is investigating could not only change the result of the Australian Grand Prix, it could change the entire season. Everything that happened after the Australian Grand Prix began to escalate in a matter of hours. What initially seemed like just a solid victory for Mercedes ended up becoming one of the most talked about topics within the paddock. While George Russell celebrated the victory and Mercedes achieved a dominant result in Melbourne, in the garages of the rival teams they began to analyze the race data in much more detail. And that was when the first signs began to appear that something was not right. Engineers from several teams detected strange patterns in the Mercedes telemetry during the Albert Park straights, especially in the way the car deployed electrical power from the hybrid system. What caught attention was that the car seemed to maintain a constant power delivery in areas where normally all cars begin to lose electrical performance due to the limits of the hybrid system. Such atypical behavior was enough for several teams to begin to suspect that Mercedes could have found a way to take advantage of a gray area in the technical regulations. From that moment on, the atmosphere inside the paddock changed completely. Ferrari, Red Bull, Ford, and other teams began exchanging technical information and reviewing comparisons of speed, energy recovery, and deployment of the hybrid system during the race. The differences were too clear to ignore. On several straight lines of the circuit, it was observed that the Mercedes maintained sustained electrical power without showing the typical clipping that appears when the system reaches the limit of available energy. In other words, while the rivals began to lose electrical power at the end of the straights, the Mercedes seemed to continue pushing with the same intensity. That detail was the trigger for some teams to prepare a technical report that they later delivered to the FIA, requesting an in-depth review of the operation of the Mercedes engine. The main suspicion revolves around two extremely sensitive areas within the power unit. On the one hand, there is the behavior of the heat engine and its compression ratio. Some leaks from the paddock suggest that Mercedes could be using a combustion architecture that, through the thermal expansion of certain components, allows the engine to operate in real conditions with a higher compression ratio than the regulations allow in theory. This could translate into greater energy efficiency and more power available during the lap. On the other hand, the second focus of the research focuses on the management of the hybrid system, especially on how energy is recovered and how it is released through the MGUK. The patterns detected in the race data suggest that the system could be using a software strategy or energy configuration that allows it to maintain electrical power for longer than the rest of the equipment. Faced with these suspicions, the FIA decided to act quickly. The regulatory body began a formal technical investigation to thoroughly review the operation of the Mercedes engine. This review includes analysis of the engine management software, power maps used during the race, and complete data from the energy recovery and deployment system. Technical delegates are also evaluating whether the system strictly complies with the limits established by the regulations or if there is some type of creative interpretation that is allowing Mercedes to gain a competitive advantage. Despite the magnitude of the controversy, for now no sanction has been applied nor has the result of the Australian Grand Prix been modified. However, the FIA has made it clear that the case remains open and that the race results remain under review while technical analysis continues. What makes this situation even more explosive is the previous context that already existed around the power units. During the winter, there had been talk on several occasions about possible regulatory loopholes within the new technical rules, and the FIA had even issued guidelines to close some interpretations that could be exploited by manufacturers. Mercedes had already been mentioned in conversations within the paddock related to these possible interpretations of the regulations. Therefore, when the team arrived in Australia and showed such a strong performance, many within Formula One immediately began to wonder if the Mercedes dominance was simply the result of great engineering work, or if there was something more behind that performance. But to understand why this investigation has caused so much tension within the paddock, we have to analyze something much deeper. What kind of advantage the Mercedes engine could really be hiding? Because in modern Formula One, where all manufacturers operate under extremely strict limits, any small difference in the hybrid system can translate into a huge advantage on the track. The first element that has put rival engineers on alert is the behavior of the Mercedes hybrid system during the straights. In current regulations, the MGUK system has a clear limit on the electrical power it can deploy during the turn. This causes a well-known phenomenon in Formula One called clipping. Basically, when the electrical system reaches its limit of available energy, the power begins to progressively drop and the car stops pushing with the same intensity at the end of the straights. It is something that happens in all cars and that the engineers have perfectly calculated within the energy strategies during the race. However, what some teams observed in the Australian Grand Prix data was completely different. According to telemetry analysis, the Mercedes seemed to maintain constant electric power for longer than the rest, even in areas where other cars were already suffering from energy clipping. This would explain why George Russell's car showed such strong acceleration on the straights of the Albert Park circuit, generating differences in top speed that immediately caught the attention of rival engineers. This is where the theory that is circulating most strongly within the paddock appears. Some teams suspect that Mercedes could have found an extremely efficient way to manage the recovery and energy deployment of the hybrid system, possibly through a combination of software, engine maps, and recovery system architecture. If the car is able to recover more energy than usual during braking or in other phases of the lap, then it could maintain a higher level of electrical power for longer without technically exceeding the limits of the regulations. But that is not the only point that is under suspicion. The second aspect that is being examined has to do with the internal combustion engine, specifically with the compression ratio of the propellant. Some leaks suggest that Mercedes could be using a setup where the thermal expansion of certain engine components causes the effective compression ratio to be higher when the engine reaches its operating temperature. In simple terms, the engine could behave as if it were running with a compression close to 18:1, when the regulations establish a geometric limit of 16:1. A difference like that would not only increase fuel efficiency, but would also allow for more thermal power to be generated during the lap. If both things were happening at the same time, a higher efficiency of the thermal engine and a more aggressive energy management of the hybrid system, the result would be exactly what we saw in Australia. A car that is extremely strong in acceleration with great top speed and capable of maintaining performance throughout the lap without showing the typical limits of the hybrid system. And that is why the reaction of the rival teams has been so intense. In Formula One, when a team finds a technical solution that approaches the limits of the regulations, the line between innovation and illegality can be extremely fine. Many of the great technical controversies in the history of the championship were born precisely like this. A creative interpretation of the rules that offers a huge advantage until the regulatory body decides to intervene. In this case, the FIA is analyzing every detail of the Mercedes system. Technical delegates are reviewing the engine maps, the hybrid system software, and all the energy data generated during the race, seeking to confirm whether the car's operation exactly complies with the limits established by the regulations or if there is any behavior that could be considered outside what is permitted. The most interesting thing is that, for now, no one within the paddock has a definitive answer. Mercedes defends that its entire system is completely legal and that the performance shown in Australia is simply the result of months of technical development. Meanwhile, rival teams believe the advantage seen in Melbourne is too great to be just a normal performance improvement. And that uncertainty is what makes this whole story even more explosive. Because if the FIA confirms that the system is legal, Mercedes will have found a technological advantage that could set the course of the entire season. But if the analysis reveals that the engine is operating outside the permitted limits, then the Australian Grand Prix could become the epicenter of one of the biggest recent technical scandals in Formula One. And what many within the paddock are already wondering is something even more disturbing. What will happen if the FIA discovers that the Mercedes engine has been running this way since before Australia? If the FIA finally determines that everything Mercedes has done is within the law, the message will be very clear. The German team would have found an extremely efficient interpretation of the technical regulations. In that scenario, the advantage seen in Australia would not be a regulatory problem, but rather a brilliant innovation that other teams would have to try to replicate as soon as possible. And that could trigger a new technological race within the championship, with manufacturers trying to copy or adapt the solutions used by Mercedes so as not to be left behind. And while the analysis continues, the big question still hangs over the paddock. The key to everything is now in the hands of the FIA technical delegates. They are the only ones who can determine if the performance shown by Mercedes is simply the result of a brilliant interpretation of the regulations or if there is an element in the hybrid system or the thermal engine that exceeds the limits established by the regulations. Until that analysis is over, Russell's victory will remain official, but it will also remain under a shadow of doubt that fuels debate within the paddock. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.